Good evening. I'm feeling a little bit personal panic right now, but it's a wonderful moment to see everybody here at Piper. My name is Su Chang. I am a Master in Architecture student here at the GSD. And before introducing our guest tonight, I would like to thank everyone that makes this event happen. Our Dean, Mohsen Musafavi, Ms. Chantel Bakley from the event office, Ms. Erica George from the student services, and also all the student helpers and staff, and as well as our beloved Professor Michael Hayes, who will be joining our student respondents and our guests later after the lecture for the brief discussion. I hope you guys can all stay for the discussion as well. So it gives me great honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Kenneth Frampton. I actually encountered Professor Frampton the same time I encountered architecture. I remember it was September 18th, 2010, exactly 6 years ago when I was a first-year student in undergraduate and just finished my first pinup in the architecture school. And then I was the Professor Frampton's lecture. So I was totally innocent to architecture. I have no idea who those architects are in your lecture at that time. But what left me great impression was Professor Frampton's great enthusiastic and optimism towards architecture, and his repeating word critical and criticality. This strong belief in the internal criticality as well as the external geography of architecture still have profound impacts on many of us. So I know many of you know very well of Professor Frampton's scholarship and teaching career. I will skip that part, and I would invite you to join me in welcoming Professor Kenneth Frampton.
Good evening. Yes, you hear me, I hope? Yes. I feel I'm kind of here under, well, I'm quite sure about it, that I'm here under somewhat false pretenses, because what do I know really about recent Chinese architecture? And so I have a few images that I will show, but before I do that, I want to make one or two sort of opening remarks. I'm sorry I'm so late because of the weather in New York. Once it rains or something, LaGuardia shuts down. So that's unfortunate. But yes, I was going to say, that I thought I should say something about, yes, well, I suppose, first of all, a bit about just the merest reference to postmodernism, and then something about about a few dates. I mean, there's a famous book by Jean-François Lyotard of 1979, which is The Postmodern Condition. And 1 year later in Venice, the Venice Biennale, the first actually architectural biennale in Venice of 1980, comes into being with sort of two slogans: the end of prohibition and the presence of the past. And in fact, I was asked to be a so-called commissioner for that exhibition, and I went to one preliminary meeting, and then I decided that this was sort of, very largely a manifestation of kitsch, and I wasn't going to participate anymore, and so I resigned. And of course, it didn't please Robert Stern, who had invited me to participate, and Robert Stern, and this is all a very long time ago, at that date was very influential in the one school of architecture in which I misspent most of my life. And I realized with this advent of what I think we were already recognized as postmodern and would indeed continue, and even up to now, I think, this phenomenon of postmodernism, I realized that some other discourse ought to be, that it was necessary to sort of have some other argument. And of course, it leads me to this question of critical regionalism I painted myself into that particular corner with an essay that appeared in 1983 towards a critical regionalism. And I know it's been transformed into critical pragmatism, but and one could spend a long time, or not perhaps so much time, but some time discussing what is the difference between the two criticals, critical regionalism versus critical pragmatism. But in any case, of course, both uses of the term critical in relation to pragmatism on the one hand and regionalism on the other is an effort to come to terms with a very bewildering period of history, I think, characterized, of course, very strongly by the speed of change. I mean, actually, when I look at this gear here and what's the latest in terms of digital projection, I realize that one can hardly keep up with the speed of technological transformation. And certainly, Chinese development. Since 1983, I mean, it just occurred to me for the first time that Deng Xiaoping opened up China to international trade and discourse in 1983. It's the same, just so happens, it's the same year of this essay towards a critical regionalism. And China would then, as you all know, only too well, engage in such a sort of such a hurricane or onslaught of development such as the world has never seen, I think, ever before, over a very short period of time. This question of speed again. I mean, an incredible rapid transformation, and so that yes, it has, I think, apocalyptical dimensions, the scale of this transformation. And I was recently, I got myself involved, I think is the best way of putting it, with expanding this book, Modern Architecture, Critical History, which has actually, as it happens, was published first in 1980, the same year as the Venice Biennale. And it staggers me looking back, that only 3 years later, I found myself writing this essay towards a critical regionalism. And I don't want to digress too much about that, but I'm already risking too many digressions. But I've been asked recently to produce a 5th edition of that book and to move it out of its kind of Eurocentric focus and take on, it's a preposterous idea, but to take on, the entire world as it has unfolded, let's say, since certainly since the 1st edition and also since the 4th edition just after the millennium. And so the idea is to produce a 5th edition, and of course that means, of course, writing about South Asia and about China and about Africa and about Anglo-America and also about Latin America and about Europe. In fact, it means dividing the world up into rather large chunks and trying to, come to terms with the last, 15, well, since the millennium, the last 15 years of development worldwide. And so I tried my hand, of course, and I still haven't finished in coming to terms with the absolute phenomenal transformations in China. And I remembered that in doing a little research on this topic, I found out, in the year 2010, which is not very long ago, China was consuming 54% of the world's concrete, 38% of the world's steel. It was building at absolute apocalyptic rate, basically. And at that same time, the number of villages in China dropped from 3.7 million to 2.6 million. Rural China undergoing corresponding, apocalyptic transformation. So much so that China was losing 300 villages a day, in fact, and so that phenomena is something I open up the whole discussion with, and I go on, of course, to talk about things like Qing Yuma's famous, you might say, canonical Father's House of 2002, which I know is out there in the form of a model, a slightly surprising model, I think. And I also spent some time talking about Yang Ho Chang and his career here, but also, of course, in China. And I talk now, rather passé about the commune at the Great Wall, and there's a very beautiful house by Yang Ho Chang, which is a sort of split house on that site. But it was some time before I would meet Wang Shu and Lewin Yu. And in fact, I met him once before he got the Pritzker Prize, and then just this year, at the end of May, I met him, and I went to this extraordinary Wenshan village, which is under, I think it's correct to say, not restoration, but a kind of progressive rebuilding. And yes, when he got the Pritzker Prize in 2012, he had so many, so many commissions he didn't know what to do with himself, basically, most of which were turned down. And actually, this image shows someone working on the stonework in this Wenshan village, which is in Guangdong, I think, and about an hour and a half's drive from Hangzhou. And so recently, I went to China for the purposes of, in fact, I gave my library, given, where I am in terms of my own chronology, to the English-speaking university in Hong Kong. And largely because of Chinese students, above all Tao Chu, who was a student in the PhD program at Columbia, and he and one other Chinese student, Eunice Singh, sort of started a movement to bring my, well, I think it's better called a collection of books, and to the Hong Kong University. And on that occasion, I went exactly at the end of May in order to sort of inaugurate the transshipment of these books to the Hong Kong University. And I with him, with Tao Tzu, took a flight for sort of overnight stay in Hangzhou with Wang Shu, and giving a talk in the Chinese Academy there, Chinese Art Academy. And I was kind of, yes, I still am a bit overwhelmed by the fact that he was so keen to receive me and to have me lecture there, and which I did on the topic of megaform as urban landscape. But the next day I had to choose between, since I didn't have any time, going to the Ningbo Museum of his, or to this village. And I'd only just discovered this village because of this 2015 issue of Architectura Viva, and this, building a new tradition, so-called timeless China. Very nice essay by, and of course, my pronunciation is just, I need a lot of instruction. But Li Jiangning, I think, wrote the main essay that accompanies this this issue of the magazine, and what impressed me enormously is this village. I mean, yes, I was sort of aware of a bit of the early work, the sort of late modernist work of Wang Shu, but I I was particularly struck by this village and by the language, his language, or their language, I should say, since it's a partnership, for this village, because what impressed me is this kind of hybrid character, of course, and this use of motifs, some of which almost have a kind of rhetorical character. I mean, the bamboo, these bamboo elements that support the overhanging roof, you know, they are rather rhetorical in a way, I think. They're kind of metaphors somehow. And on the other side, of course, you have this kind of, well, it's somewhat Western, I think, this in the end, you know, this kind of sort of Neo-Palladian stripped concrete arcade. And more, yes, this is the village, and it's still, you know, it's still a project, an ongoing project. And we spent, I mean, I don't know, 6 hours in this village going from one place to another. I think it's a remarkable work, and actually one of the things about him is the fact that he was asked by the municipality, you know, to design a museum, and he said, "Oh no, I will only design a museum if you give me a village." In fact, it's like kind of Hillary Clinton's only takes a village, and so he got this village, and this is still very much an ongoing project. And yes, so the interesting thing, the interesting approach is that he did work with the local agrarian community, farmers, mostly very small-scale farming, sort of horticultural farming, and also breeding silkworms. Quite a lot of the houses are devoted to raising silkworms. And he tried, and well, he insisted to upgrade the standard, because most of these houses were about 120 square meters. So in the rebuilding operation, they were twice that size, 250 square meters. And they had, you know, well, the clients asked for more than one living room, so there was a living room which would be used as a television room, of course, such as the time we are living in, and a separate sort of main space used as a dining room, plus, of course, bedrooms and a utility room, well, kitchen, bathroom, 3 bedrooms actually, mostly, and a utility room which was used either for storage or for the breeding of silkworms, such as the extent to which the economy is very much sort of still based on silkworm production. And this village, you know, stretches out along this continuous river, and of course it goes back. So some of the work, I think, is quasi-restoration, and some of it, this lot here, and we were looking at this street earlier, is really rebuilding. And well, here you see the river, which looks a bit dry in this image, but in fact was in full flood when I was there. And there is something, I suppose you could say, Lausanne about this treatment. I mean, it's very sophisticated use of fenestration in these cubic forms, and of course using rendering, and again this black, yes, tile, I think, really. It's a kind of stone tile. And then there's also something a bit Zittesque about the whole operation, you know, this figure, Camillo Zitter, in that there are these little set pieces that, like this covered bridge, which is also a place to sit, and that sort of divide up the rhythmic pattern of the village as it extends along the waterfront. What is going on here? Okay. And then this use of wood, you know, also on the inside, so that actually all the houses, you enter through a courtyard. In many cases, the rooms around the courtyard are lined in wood, with windows opening on to the lower level that you see in this image. And well, that in this very short survey of Galeano, Luis Fernandez Galeano, there are a number of other works that are included, and like this project, which is by this firm called Scenic Architecture, and which is actually a community center near Shanghai. And well, I suppose the most fundamentally kind of hybrid radical feature is, in fact, the gable is full of wood. This use of wood, very kind of refined wood louvers, you know, that is not really, it's not really, I think, a Chinese thing. And certainly the gable would normally not be filled with wood. And so that's, I'm sorry, out of order, but that's just, yeah, so this is the very crude sections through this community center, where you see that, you know, the traditional roof structure appears, you know, as it does, of course, in, or versions of a pseudo-traditional roof structure appears, as it does, of course, in Wang Shu's Chinese Art Academy in Hangzhou. And, well, the plan is sort of a little weird, really, I think. I mean, it's, and of course, there's no information. That's, so that this seems to be the adult part of the community center with a sort of cafe, I suppose, and dining facilities with these courtyards separating them out. And you notice these sort of freestanding columns that relate to the roof structure. And then this seems to be the children's wing. That I take it that these are beds for children to rest on. I can't figure out, but there's no information in the publication at all about that. And this is, I'm told to try the other one. All right. Okay, there we are. And that gives one, I think, an idea of the gable end and the use of, well, it's a curtain wall, after all, of wood and glass. And this is a tea house in Beijing, so-called tea cafe. Oh, I should mention that these guys who do that is this by Scenic Architecture, I was very impressed by, now I forget exactly where it is, a beach facility by Scenic Architecture, which is sort of one of the most amazing kind of constructivist, yes, functionalist disposition of restaurant and bathing facilities, you know, on the edge of a beach with ramps and so on. A language that is completely other than this language from Scenic Architecture. And this one is Arc Studio Architects. It's a tea cafe in Huitong in Beijing. And I think in a way it's, actually there's a model of that in the exhibition as well. Not a particularly good model either, but I mean, I think this project is a little weird because this concrete roof, you know, sits, in my opinion, in a very uncomfortable relationship to these traditional pieces, and inside it doesn't get that much better. You know, it doesn't become more sophisticated, including these Danish chairs. I think they are Danish chairs, of course, modeled on traditional Chinese furniture. And then there is an episode in the same space, which is like this, you know, it could be by Sana or something, you know, influence of the Japanese on China, for God's sake. And I think not very convincing, you know, sorry, not very convincing. And so, and then there's this extraordinary thing by Zhao. you know, ZAO. It's a visitor center in the Himalayas. I think it's absolutely mind-bogglingly powerful piece in stone and concrete, of course. It's in the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region, and it's on Mount Namcha, 7,782 meters high, and but what fascinates me about it is you can think there are sort of two basic influences, I would argue. You know, one, of course, is Louis Kahn, somewhat, and more forcefully, perhaps, Peter Zumthor's Bals, you know. And, well, it's very impressive, and it's also not so easy to understand. That is exactly how the space is distributed inside. You know, it's for mountain climbers. There's a huge gorge that at the bottom of this whole thing that goes on for 400 kilometers. You know, it's a huge scale. And but it is for mountain climbers, and well, you see, it's all in stone except the core is concrete. And then, yes, so you have to try to figure out what all of this is. It's obviously some of it is bathrooms, kitchen, and administration, and so on. But the listed program is reception room, public toilets, specialized store, a bar, service for mountain climbers, changing rooms, meeting rooms, offices for guides and drivers, and somewhere, God knows, there is a power plant. And but unnumbered, again, one lacks really precise information. But this is the technology, you know, it is stone on the outside, you know, and stone capping with a concrete core and insulation. It's hard to know exactly. There must be a beam here somewhere or other, but it's hard to figure out where it is. More of the same. And then there is this item, which is in Hunan, Baojing, Hunan. I think it's a hospital. Also, in the same, it's all in the same issue. The architects in this case are somebody called Rural Urban Framework, and John Lin and Joshua Bolchover. And they got an Aga Khan Award for this, I think. Yes, it's a sort of spiral idea. You don't get it from here. This facade is, you know, very thin windows and brick. But and you can see the context. That's also rather interesting. The context, I think. And then it is a sort of spiraling building. You enter on a ramp and you continue to climb up. The ramp itself, quite wide, becomes a kind of continual waiting room, and it's a very small health facility, and it has, and it makes a big use of precast concrete components which screen the ramp as you rise, and there is a kind of amphitheater in the core of this spiraling form. And it is otherwise, of course, reinforced concrete frame construction. It's nowhere near as sophisticated as the thing I was just showing you, but it's another example. And we have this, which is a section which shows the way the ramps. They're kind of stepped ramps, really. They're stramps that climb up, you know, the spiral, and it shows you the amphitheater also, and something of the context. But I want to, this is it. We will soon be entering the so-called discussion phase, because this is my last piece, which is Wang Shu and the amateur architect studio, Lu and Yu, etc. And as far as I can judge, this is a kind of hotel, And actually, in my case, I sort of spent a night in it. So, yeah, a fairly comfortable night. I mean, there didn't seem to me there were that many rooms. It's partly a social center, partly a hotel. There are rooms, there are dining rooms, there's a little restaurant, more than a little restaurant. I think it's a substantial restaurant. And so it's used for, small conferences, for reception, yes, this is kind of conference center come hotel. But the amazing thing is it's covered in this roof, this continuous roof. And someone told me that Wang Shu had seen somewhere a village, remote, that was covered with a single roof. And so that's the roof. This drawing is a little weird because one doesn't quite know what to make of this. Well, in fact, as you probably know, and some of you must have been there, there is an obsession with staircases and galleries and staircases, and in most cases, the galleries and staircases are running on the outside of the various faculty buildings that make up the Chinese Academy. But here the galleries and staircases are within, under this roof, and I take it, well, I don't know how else to read the drawing, that these are certain galleries that seem to be like non sequiturs rising up under the roof. And the whole thing, anyway, it sits next to a stream in the center of this, more or less center of this academy. And, yeah. So the incredible thing is that, and that I don't, well, I think I was thinking about, what would I say, I think that, actually I wrote a piece that, I don't know, it's a long time ago now, which played on Nicholas Pevsner's comment that Adolf Loos is an enigma, and, which of course certain Italians would completely refute. But I think there is something enigmatic about Loos's overall production. And I think there's something enigmatic about Wang Shu's total production also. Because, when you look at, sorry, I need to go back, yeah. When you look at the fact that these different spaces, and don't really ask me to name, now there is a number code, but I don't have, this was sent to me recently by Wang Shu. And I don't have the key, for what all of this is, actually. And I can't remember either. I was in it. It's labyrinthine, of course, And I don't remember there being so many parallel walls. But, obviously there are. And I do remember there being these extraordinary staircases, that seem to arise from nowhere and lead to bridges, and they go down. So now the staircases, instead of being on the outside, are mainly within the body of the building. And this is the upper level, but I'm no more, other than just showing it. I cannot be more articulate about what is what, And, all right. And then this is the roof. And you see, again, like some kind of parasites, these staircases are up here under the roof, There are other staircases, but these are shown. And there are voids, of course, top lights in the roof system. And this is it, And this roof cascades over the top of these walls. I should now say that these walls are adobe, I think slightly reinforced with cement, and they're red and yellow earth walls that are taken nearby. There are two different quarries, one red, one yellow. And then they are stabilized by a reinforced concrete frame in most instances, and these cross walls. And then, now I think the language is becoming, see, this roof, and then, and also here's my ignorance again, but I do know that Lu Wenyu is somehow, if he is a genius of drawing in pencil, And he does say somewhere, I am the one who draws in pencil, and my wife comes and criticizes me. But that's in this very beautiful Lars Muller book, which contains, at the time of the Wang Shu's Pritzker Prize, this book is published by Lars Muller, which is full of nothing but drawings, and some very interesting comments, one of which I've just cited. But I think I sort of dimly remember sort of something like, sort of almost like geodesic structures made out of wood, or tensegrity structures made out of wood, that I think primarily are due to the skill of his wife in handling wood. And this, of course, he doesn't say this, and no text I've read says this either, but I think that this whole roof is very much, the actual wooden structure, which, you can't really call it a space frame. You can see that it depends, you see every so often, on top of the cross walls, there are steel and steel joists on steel tubes, extending the cross walls up to carry the roof. And and so we see more of this, the same, and the way that, and you see, I suppose that's the point. Some of these stairs go over the top, and then down again. But unlike the other buildings, they're not running on the elevation, they're within the body of the building. More of the same. And you see, now you see perhaps very clearly the way these stairs take off, and there's a whole itinerary of stairs running up inside here. And well, let's look. And well, when I'm with him there, at some point he starts to talk about Piranesi's carcery, and I'm very, I find that kind of very impressive that he makes this reference, and also when I look at the detailing of the steel, and also this use of adobe, I think that it's close to Scarpa actually. So it's sort of Marco Polo in reverse. This magus of Chinese architecture is looking at Italy, and on two different moments in history, of course. I mean, you can. It's a very crude comparison, but for instance, the roof over the museum in Verona, Castelvecchio, of this kind of roof that's called, of course, Scarpa, and we know Scarpa is very much. Scarpa had a great respect for Chinese work, and here, this is my last image, is a bit of a detail about the roof and the walls, Not too easy for me to code it either, but, you get it. This really crazy, ingenious truss system. And that's my last image, and I think, no, not quite. Oh, you see, here, I mean, it's the same. But, look, these stairs take off, and actually these kind of galleries sometimes sort of terminate in sort of belvedere like sitting places to look out over the water and the campus as a whole. And well, here, finally, I'm beginning to understand my own material. Here you see, this is the stair going up on top of the roof. And here, maybe better than anything I've shown up to now, shows the red and yellow adobe walls, the way they're reinforced by the concrete, stabilized by the concrete frame. Sometimes there are in situ walls in situ concrete going right across. There's little kind of strange patio gardens, that on one side, on the other side, you get the water. Well, more of the same. I think that is the last slide, is it? No, more of the same. It goes on. Yeah. It's an extraordinary work. Goes on and on. And here, you know, the mixture of the adobe, you know, some red and some, well, not exactly yellow, but anyway, here he's using mixed material. Well, it reminds one, of course, of the Ningbo Museum. And this you can see this is a kind of café terrace, you know. And here is the continuous stream. Oh yeah, and then there are these unbelievable, I mean, this is like a parody of the sort of moon window opening in the Chinese wall. I mean, this is you could qualify as fairly aggressive, I think, plastically, and very emotional space. I mean, here, of course, you have a Institute concrete wall. And I've forgotten that these cross pieces are lined in bamboo in this way. More of the same. And you see the concrete frame, of course, appears here. And this looking down on, yes, reflecting pools then cascade into the river. I mean, it's incredible. You look right down here, you know, and the complexity of this circulation becomes very apparent, I think. Also, again, the adobe and the frame. That's it. Okay, so I don't have too many images, but I think not quite sure how to. I mean, we know, you know, yes. Well, maybe I should end on this note. Maybe some of you can remember, but I can't quite remember. But I think like 3 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago, the Central Committee of the party said that they were going to move 350 peasants from the countryside into the city in order to create a consumer society. I mean, I just think this is like a historic moment like a mind-boggling historic moment, that what is still basically a communist government, the People's Republic of China, should have the aim to move the population of the United States from the countryside in the next 10 years. This is about 3 years ago. I don't know whether that project is still moving. But I mean, the way the whole thing ends, you know, in order to create a consumer society, that is pretty sobering. And yes, and so it brings me back to Wang Shu and to, you know, this architecture of resistance in a way. He uses that term, resistance, and I guess his involvement, he doesn't use the term critical regionalism nor the term critical pragmatism, I don't think, but he does use this term resistance. And so this is my little piece on China, which you'll be happy to hear I'm not going to read, you know, which is, you know, the draft of an entry that I hope to put in this expanded book. But then I sent it to Tao Tzu in Hong Kong, and he was not very happy with this thing. And he mentioned Liu Jiakun, who is out there, you know, with this extraordinary perimeter block. And he mentioned Liu Jiakun because of his politics, you know. And Tao Tzu is somebody who has a very kind of, what can I say, delicate relationship with the People's Republic of China. He is from there, of course, but he lives and teaches in Hong Kong University and goes backwards and forwards, but it's, and is very critical. He is very critical, not only of me, but also of the, yes, Chinese power, and very pro Liu Jiakun. And he said, there's no mention in this essay of yours about Liu Jiakun. I mean, yeah, what's the matter with you? And now I realize what he's talking about, because that's the first time I've seen that perimeter, this extraordinary perimeter block, which may share something with Wang Shu in as much as there are sort of these strange ramps that criss and cross up one side of it. But that's it. That's some extent of my provocation. Thank you.
maybe we can now invite Michael for a very brief response, and we can invite our 3 student respondents to the front as well. And just, everyone can just jump in for questions or comments anytime if you want to. Yeah.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm going to keep my comments brief and then join Yoon and Tairan. No, I won't join Yoon and Tairan. Ken will join Yoon and Tairan for the discussion. No, this last bit reminds me of why I thought the pairing of Kenneth Frampton with, in a way, the show outside, ChinaGSD, the interest in this and other interests, was such a good idea. For my generation, Kenneth represented one of the very few scholars that we took seriously, let's say even ideologically or politically as well as intellectually. And there's a discourse underneath Kenneth's still apparent ethics. Maybe ethics is a better word than politics, actually. There's a discourse under there, a real commitment to recuperation of issues like micropolitics, ecology, and as he said, even a kind of partisan resistance. The 1983 essay that he mentioned, underneath that was a weaving together of the traditions of the Frankfurt School that we still study in this school, of hermeneutic phenomenology. It included the writings of Hannah Arendt, of Jürgen Habermas, of Martin Heidegger, and Paul Ricoeur. I'm not just name dropping. What I'm suggesting is an intellectual commitment that's very, very deep. This is my first point that makes, I think, Kenneth's work appropriate to a kind of a match with trying to unpack contemporary architecture in China. It turns out that between 1985 and 1989 in China, I mentioned this at the last conference on the museum talk, I will continue to mention it until somebody proves me right or wrong. So this is the charge to the students. It turns out over 100 theory texts were translated into Chinese, including Frankfurt School writers like Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, Marcuse, interesting not Hannah Arendt, but also Habermas, Ricoeur, and Heidegger. And I'm just showing Heidegger's, the early book of Heidegger, Being and Time, translated. It was part of what I would, I'm not talking about the importance of philosophy, I'm actually talking about a parallel displacement of philosophy and appropriation of philosophy into what we now call theory. And this is the beginning in the West, in the Europe and the States, of contemporary architecture theory. And I'm wondering if there is something, if work could be done to trace some of this work like we're seeing, like Kenneth showed tonight, like is in the show. There are discourses that underpin that work. There are conversations in cafes. There are scribbles on paper napkins. Architects do read. There are discourses that underpin that, and even discourses. I'm not suggesting that Wang Xu read Building and Dwelling. What I'm suggesting is that somebody else, one of his students, might have read it and told him about it, something like this. The word resistance is a very particular word. It's a very particular word, and it would be interesting to see how that. I'm quite sure that Ai Weiwei is part of this. I just wonder if they're architects. How do I, yeah. Just real, will you do this? Just real quickly, just to remind you, in Kenneth's formulation of critical regionalism, it comes from, is this also a pointer? Yes. It comes from a kind of dialectic between Ricoeur's version of universal technology and traditional regional culture. And it couldn't map onto China better the way that, like you say, this de-villagization of China into a very high-tech and leveling technology that destroys traditional culture. This is Heidegger's kind of more Germanic Raum, a bounded, particularized place, as distinct from what Heidegger called a more Latin, extended, and kind of gridded space. There's, of course, scenographic images versus tectonic construction, and Kenneth is the one who made tectonics such a central part of contemporary architecture discourse. There are typology versus topography. These are repetitive, reiterative, formal structures versus site-specific, tactile, bodily, and then there is sensuous, experiential conditions, and that versus purely visual representation. It seems like to me that this actually, what Kenneth did was take a description of architecture that he thought was authentic, say that of Louis Kahn, and then with that description made a prescription of what we should be doing. And it involves the relationship of these dyads to one another. In some ways, it wasn't possible in the States or in Europe to fulfill that project. The sort of site-specific topography, the tectonic craft construction, the admittedly and enthusiastically, quote-unquote, retrogressive component of critical regionalism didn't seem legitimate in the States. It somehow seems legitimate in places where handicraft is still vital, viable, and continuous, like parts of South Asia, like at least parts of China. So I think this critical regionalism that exhibits this tension between description and prescription that seeks to take features and promote them for future works. It's as if the Chinese sort of non-institution, if I have that right, architecture in some way are answering that call. So I was thinking maybe this is what we can discuss, that some modification of critical regionalism is not a bad place to begin. If we can imagine a rebooting or a kind of CR 2.0, I think part of what it would do would seek a deeper historical logic in the past of current systems. It's very interesting to me that critical regionalism requires a going back into certain tectonic and constructional systems that we, at least, I think I didn't have examples of until recently. The way that Wang Xu can use traditional laying up of the tile and the brick legitimately. It's not faked somehow. It's not reconstructed. It's a continuous part of a past that still exists. I would just end with one more suggestion. That to this we might add, and this is something I hope to discuss in courses later, one more dyad of absorption and theatricality. I'm borrowing this, some of you know this from Michael Fried, an old book where he distinguishes in painting absorption and theatricality. I think we see it in China. Theatricality at its best would be Zaha's Galaxy, Soho, something that involves the viewer, that's spectacular, but that also is a pure symptom of impatient capital, let's say, in Rahul Mehrotra's word. Where absorption would be, I don't know, Wang Xu, Scott Cohen, a structure that is more absorbed in resolving itself than in presenting itself as a spectacle. It follows from scenography versus topography and things like that, or representation versus experience. But I think absorption and theatricality, a kind of rewriting of that, might be a good addition to these dyads of critical regionalism in the case of China. Thanks.
Thank you. If I can invite our student respondents, Kyle, Yun, and Tairan to the front, and also Kenneth, if you can. Yeah. We may need an additional chair. Maybe we can, yeah.
Is it on? Oh. Thank you, Professor Frampton, and thank you, Michael. I was actually really happy that Michael brought up the question about translation, about in the late 1980s, what we call the cultural fever period of time. Because Professor Frampton, I don't know, you may know or you may not know that how much impact you made to the Chinese architects, notably after the publication of the translation of two of your most important books, the 1980 book, Modern Architecture, Critical History, which was later translated into Chinese in 1988, which is exactly during the time when those theories, Heidegger, Paul Ricoeur, were pouring into China. During that period of time, halted by the Tiananmen Square. So, of course, the subsequent editions of the book translated, and with the latest version translated in 2012, I believe the next edition will be translated soon afterwards. And the 1995 book, Studies in Tectonic Culture, which was translated in 2007. And over those years, there have been quite a few discussions on the concepts that are crucial to your theoretical framework, like you mentioned, critical regionalism and tectonics and resistance, and also cultural identity, which is almost many people's favorite word in China, not only in the field of architecture, but also in many other fields in recent years. And I remember there's a personal experience that I remember there was one time several years ago, after the translation of tectonics, I was at a lecture by the Chinese architect Zhang Lei, after which there's one guy who asked the question, are you tectonic enough? So for me, it's like your term tectonics, or I mean the architectural term tectonics in China, kind of became or kind of reduced to a evaluation criteria. To some extent, I feel like the theoretical construct of yours, inadvertently kind of has conflated the diverse architectural tendencies that it championed in a way. I was thinking, Manfred Tafuri took a quotation from the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, that words and or language can be petrified and hard as stone. So I was curious about the thoughts you might have in terms of the reception of your theories in China and beyond, or to frame the question in another way, what are the expectations you might have for your readers?
You mean architectural citations?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm so. I mean, the speed of development and the scale of it is so. It's overwhelming, really. I think not only in China but elsewhere, and citations are quite. Well, I suppose you're saying what works could be considered to be a sort of model for future practice. I mean, it's clear that those works have existed in the past, and I think at the same time one ought to recognize that there is not just one practice, and that there is not just one model either of practice, and also that culture sort of has a rhythm to it. It even at a fragmentary scale, but also at a larger scale, a movement or certain kind of body of work starts to appear. It rises, it sort of becomes very present, and then it sort of diminishes. I mean, I think it's part of culture that there is this sort of this movement, and that movement takes place over a varying time, in different places over quite varied time scales, Of course, in the moment of history we're living in is so fast that the movements are fast also, and yes, I mean, one could sort of, reduce it to fashion, but it transcends fashion. I think it's something else, and in fact, in trying to write, to expand modern architectural critical history, I mean, the big issue is, by what do you include and what do you exclude? What is the criteria of judgment? Playing the kind of Olympian kind of critic, so to speak. How can you justify your own reflection in a way on what is appearing, what is being produced? And I recently had to think about that rather hard, and I still haven't been able to formulate it very well. By what criteria? It seems to me that there is, on the one hand, the modern movement, and the continuity of the modern movement, which had, I think, which beginning in Europe in the period between the First World War and the Second World War, definitely had a social program in relation to a kind of language, a certain expression, also in relation to a certain societal, you could even say political aim. And when that movement arrives in the United States, 1932, more or less, you can say, what came is mainly the language, but not the social program. And American architecture is a reflection of that, I think, and even up to now, and because it's very much got to do with the kind of society that the United States has been and still is, in a way. And so that, vis-a-vis modern movement, but then I think one also has to recognize, continuities of tradition, which are not strictly speaking the modern movement, and how to sort of weave these two together, even though Lucan was sort of, maybe part of the American New Deal, also ideologically, the mature body of his work is not really modern movement in that sense, It's returning to some kind of tradition, rather complex tradition, I think. And so, there seems to be that maybe it's not really a pertinent reflection on what you posed to me, but I'm a bit sort of hung up on this. On the one hand, the modern movement, and on the other hand, traditions which are not part of the modern movement. And that, there is this amazing map that Le Corbusier makes of the Voyage d'Orient, this trip he takes in 1912, He doesn't publish the map until 1925. But the map has cities of Europe, and against these cities he puts in different densities, the letter C, the letter F, and the letter I. F stands for folklorique. You could say F stands folklorique equals vernacular. I, of course, equals the industry. You could say equals technology. And C, a little bit more problematic, but he gives it he calls it culture, somewhat ambiguous. But I find I'm more and more preoccupied with this map and these three poles because well, take it a little bit further. I think by C, in the European case, he means classic, somehow. Culture is classic, I think. So that, in the idea of a new modern culture, in his case, there are these sort of three strands, that are mixing but also breaking apart. And you can see evidence of those strands in the early purist, in his early purist work, And I somehow think that, but I can't make it sufficiently clear to myself or anybody else, that this when I try to talk about traditions, and the modern movement as opposed to tradition, somewhere, maybe these this triad that he develops is more interesting, more, what I want to, no, not more interesting, but more productive as a concept than my efforts to distinguish between traditions that are not really intrinsically part of the modern movement and the modern movement. That maybe isn't, I didn't really mention a particular model, except I did, well, for example, since I mentioned it already, the Leo Jacquin's perimeter block, is surely a continuation of the modern movement, but it's more questionable that the ZAO, is that the name of this group, ZAO, climbers, this building in stone up in the Himalayas. That building, which owes something to Khan and maybe also to Zumthor, in stone on top of concrete, is not, you can't really say that that's the modern movement, I think, But you can say it represents some kind of continuity of a tradition, if you like, tectonic tradition. But in a way, those two, if you take those two things, the Leo Jacquin perimeter block and the Zhao sort of mountain retreat station, they represent two quite different models of two different cultural, you could say, stroke political models.
If you can make it brief, like the comment, so we can have time for the audience.
I'll be very brief, but thank you first for your presentation. It's very refreshing to hear a critic to speak directly about how other architects work as opposed to the polished version in your book. But you use very often the word apocalyptic to frame the Chinese circumstance, and because of this, you present the architecture seen now as being very unique in history. But a lot of our literature, at least the quantitative ones, they see a lot of parallel between the process that China is going through now to perhaps the process of modernization in Japan and then the four Asia dragons. And in fact, if you compare the normalized terms, the rate of change in China is actually not as quick as, say, something like Korea during its most turbulent times, or even to the Italian circumstance. And a lot of scholars use the word flying geese formation to describe this kind of a similar pattern, first occurring in Japan, then in Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then in the first-tier cities of China, and then the second-tier cities of China. So even you yourself note a lot of similarities between the Japanese architects, which you obviously have written a lot about, to the Chinese works that are being produced now. So I wonder, how much difference do you see between the Japanese circumstance, say, in the times of Taro Ando, or a lot of architects that you were you had written a lot about, to the circumstance that is in China now?
Well, I use the word apocalyptic. I don't just use. Actually, arriving in Hangzhou, I remember the plane coming, and then this kind of this very alienating landscape of slab blocks, autoroutes, etc., etc. And then you come to the historic city, which hasn't been touched. And so somehow a bit of a surprise after passing through, this landscape. But vis-a-vis, you said many things. I mean, I think I'm not really able to judge, statistically, how does the Chinese expansion compare to the Japanese or Korean or other Asian modernizations. I do think that in the Michael referred to Paul Ricoeur's text, which I was very inspired by when I first tried to glue this idea of critical regionalism together, where he distinguishes between universal civilizations, singular, and national cultures, plural. And then he somewhere says, very soberly, not every culture can withstand the process of modernization. That, and I like, it's a very different world, but recently I tried for the first time in my life to look at Africa, and somehow those words recur in my head. Not every culture can withstand the process of modernization. I mean, many cultures, of course, are completely wiped out by the mobilization. Languages, of course, are wiped out, and with those languages go the culture that accompanies the languages. They're gone, they're wiped out. And modernization is, yes, it's a force, of course, and yeah, I mean, it's just extremely present. I mean, everywhere, everywhere. Here, of course, very much here in the States. I remember thinking about, yes, about this this problem of national cultures versus universal civilization, and how you could apply the model to the States. I mean, not every culture can withstand the onslaught of modernization, even the culture which creates the modernization. Because it has, of course, as Michael mentioned, the no longer forbidden word of capitalism. It is, of course, linked to capitalism, and we're stuck with it somewhat, I think. But there are moments when it was less, when it was possible to mediate certain forces, and I think that architecture itself depends on a kind of mediation. That the culture of architecture is a mediation of reality in a way, and therefore it has kind of at its best a sort of resistant character, because it seeks to mediate what is otherwise given, given by the modernization, I mean, So, I mean, that's why many building developers, of course it's impossible to work for them because they're not interested in anything that you could call culture. They're just interested in the maximizing profit. So the discussion ends there on the spot, It's not possible to have a discussion because the two, they're not interested in mediating. And I think that that's what architects have to try to, that's a challenge of being an architect, I think, that it's, it is this question of the limits of architecture also have to be thought about, that you can't, I mean, that brings me to, and I'll stop, because I'm taking too much time, but, I mean, there is a moment between the two world wars when, it was possible to believe that the modernity could also carry with it a kind of social justice and more equal distribution of wealth, etc., etc. But that, that period has passed, and it's interesting that rural China, that, does represent a domain that is inherently resistant, I think. And, but anyway, that's enough.
Kyle.
I couldn't help but to notice the number of, let's say, monolithic buildings that appeared in the series of works, and it made me reminded me a little bit of this idea of time and speed that goes parallel to architecture, but also of a lecture that Wang Shu actually gave at MIT about 1.5 years ago, in which he described the kind of struggle of being presented with a new series of works that were being commissioned in Europe to him. And the struggle was because, as he explains, architecture needed time, but also needed an understanding of the place. And the place that, as I understood, it wasn't necessarily the site, but the culture that goes with it, right? The material culture. And so the struggle is that, in a way, we, in this series of works, I mean, kind of these buildings, right, made out of stone, adobe, gives the idea that one needs time and go through a thinking process to leave, let's say, such mark on a ground or on a place or even in a culture as it pertains to the society. But I'm also left with the other side of, or the other half of the story, which are the existential conditions that occur in cities today, right? In which they are not necessarily afforded by the idea of time and thinking. And so I'm wondering, in your new book or in your new writings or in the new CR 2.0, as Michael mentions, what are some of the maybe suggestions and tips that it might provide to let's say, these new architectures that are surging right now, not only in China but also in other parts that still want to keep thinking of architecture as something that is historical and traditional as well?
Yeah, okay. I mean, they're heavy, these questions, but I mean, they're totally justified. I mean, well, let me just start. This question of the city, I think that the megalopolis, which I think the figure is a French geographer, coins the term in 1960, I think, to describe the eastern seaboard of the United States, the continuous urban region that runs from Boston down to Washington, and also the parallel on the west coast, and you could say, it runs down the link to Japan, etc., Hokkaido to Kyushu and so on. But as a kind of built real condition, a modernization that took that. There's a wonderful title of a Frank Lloyd Wright book, "The Industrial Revolution Runs Away." This modernization that took on a continental scale, and I think Asia probably has experienced much the same. Well, Japan anyway. And what can architects, or for that matter, urban design, contribute to that? That's big question mark. I mean, since you mentioned it, it's hard to say. What can one contribute? I think that recently, because in trying to write this 5th edition, I had to sort of think for the first time seriously and include, in moving back in time, Jose Luis Sert, for example, who was here, etc., and who was able to conceive and get built kind of mega urban pieces, maybe not so mega, but small urban pieces, also in this area, in Cambridge and so on, and that achievement of his was not followed much afterwards, maybe for all sorts of different reasons. But anyway, I think he invented the term urban design in a way, and he probably was first and last, maybe even the last urban designer, as a matter of fact. He published in 1948 a book called "Can Our City Survive?" I mean, where he always putting a question mark over it. I mean, the only contribution I fiddled around with is to think that could one. I think landscape is terribly important. I think in terms of mediation of the megalopolis, landscape is a fundamental agent. Right? I think landscape is maybe more important than urban design, more to contribute to the fields of architecture than urban planning or I mean, it's scandalous to say these things, but I think that, I'm not very convinced by the urban planning discourse or by urban design discourse, but I am much more convinced by landscape design discourse, and also strategic landscape, regional landscape. And of which there are some very good French designers, or others, of course. But so I think landscape perhaps is one mode of intervention in relation to the megalopolis that can be meaningful, But the other part of your question, which, I don't quite know how to deal with it. I better stop, I think. It's too difficult. What was the other part?
I guess it would, to which extent the revision or the redux of your writing now affords us, let's say, the new generation of urban designers, planners, landscape architects, and architects, suggestions and tips to continue to slow down the process, or to at least to be critical.
I guess I have kind of answered it. By the way, you have this unbelievable landscape designer in Beijing, don't you? Chinese, with a big office and what's his name? Yeah. And I don't know enough about him, I mean, but he was trained here and all that, right? I mean, yes. So I mean, that's someone that I have to know, I have to go and meet him. I don't know what, he has to come. I have to find, I need more information.
Do you have any questions or comments from the audience? We have.
Thank you, Professor Frampton. I just want to go back to your point about sort of the difference between critical pragmatism in China versus, your notion of critical regionalism. And so it's a combination of a comment and a question, I guess. And so for me, as Shangning, the curator, describes critical pragmatism, it's sort of the way that Chinese architects in the 80s begin to shift away from or create these private practices as opposed to state-led design institutions. It's a resistance to the political condition in China at the time. And also it's sort of a resistance against economic speculation of property developers. So that's sort of the definition that's out there. And then I want to sort of move on to, one example would be Shangning was talking about how Wang Shu was not registered when he got the Pritzker Prize. And so when he won it, the state authorities didn't even know who he was, right? So that was an interesting point. But then to go on to your point about sort of the difference between Japan, China, and Korea, I think the difference that I see is that both in Japan and Korea, the idea of state formation and the profession and the formation of the architecture profession itself as a private mode of practice kind of unfold at the same time in the 20s in Japan and sort of in the 60s in Korea. But in the Chinese instance, what I see is this divergence between state formation and the formation of the profession in the Chinese context. It's much more uneven. And then to go back to the point about the difference between the sort of the critical pragmatism and the critical regionalism is that your points about critical regionalism, to me, critical regionalism seems to be a resistance against architectural discourse on high modernism or the actual movement of high modernism itself, right? So it's more of a architecture qua architecture sort of critique as opposed to critical pragmatism, which is more sort of against the political condition of the nation itself, right? And then so my last sort of question to summarize this would be, if it is really, if the Chinese case is really sort of trying to resist the speculative modes and sort of the economic conditions, etc., but how is it actually, I personally am kind of skeptical and cynical about the possibility of architecture to kind of entirely sort of resist this speculative mode. The example you gave is a hotel, right? And that it's hard to say that is resisting sort of economic speculation. The very idea of a hotel business is speculative. So I think, is it is the optimism, does it lie on the level of discourse and sort of our position as theorists and historians, and how much can the built environment actually respond to it?
Yeah, I understand. I mean, just to pick up on the hotel thing, I mean, that hotel at Wangshu's is not a, it doesn't relate to any kind of idea of a hotel in the United States. It's really a sort of small building in a university. It's a,
Yes, maybe just to clarify, the hotel is actually like a hostel for visiting scholars for the academy.
Right, yes,
it's not a...
It is. And so it's not really a hotel, but the bigger issue that you're talking about, which I didn't know about, the relationship of the profession to the state, and how and your argument that in the Japanese case the state was more, and it's a very interesting point, I think, that the state was more committed to developing the architectural profession in relation to the state and as a policy in relation to the modernization of Japan. And I think it goes back even before the Second World War, to the 30s, to the Showa period and so on, even with all the dark aspects of that as well. But I think, probably that in the case of Japan, there was this connection between the state and the profession. And that would apply, let's say, also to Finland, that there's no question that Finnish also culture politics, political policy, was very much connected to architecture, and in this balancing act between the Soviet Union and the West, in a way, the Finns used architecture as a sort of cultural balancing device in a way. They had a good tradition to build on, of course, and also on a kind of social democratic idea of the state as well, and so those are certain moments, and I think perhaps there's work perhaps to be done about comparing different moments, because I talked earlier about moments having a trajectory in which they rise, they peak, and then they it could also be applied to the relationship between the state and architecture. Because I feel right today, that for instance, Japanese architecture has become, in my opinion, very weak. And I'm sorry to say, I'm not convinced by Sana and all the rest of it. I'm not convinced by the wave of very mannered Japanese minimalism. It doesn't do anything for me at all. Compared to Mayakawa, Kenzo Tange, who are they? What are we talking about? It's like total regression, in my opinion. And it's very prejudiced, but that's how I feel about it. And I think in the work out there also the little glimmers of the influence of Japanese, mannered behavior also on Chinese work. The other thing that one has to it's difficult to handle is, it's a competitive profession, right? Architects compete with each other, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's tricky, But I think in places like this, it ought to be able to have a discourse in which, as we are having in a way, about what kind of cultural strategies could be productive, over a wider front than, say, one's own individual career, I think. But I like very much your intervention.
Just was on a trip with some of the ChinaGSD students last year, and we visited some architects who were fairly critical of Wangshu in the sense they said he's too literal and too there had to be an architect like that, but they thought he was too literal in the interpretation. So where do you draw the line between some literal interpretation and more of an essence, where the essence of the architecture is captured without being necessarily obviously Chinese or traditional in any way? Yes,
you could make other criticisms, because you know, what is it? The reception, the building I showed, the building in the Chinese Art Academy. You know, it is also very mannered, and also not particularly economic, you know, and sort of uneconomic, really. And yes, so it is, and that's why I use the word enigma in relation to him in a way. I mean, I really respect what he's doing, but you know, there's something enigmatic about it at the same time, you know. And even he writes about it in a somewhat enigmatic way as well, about drinking tea and all the rest of it, and so on. But it's extraordinary work because it is, you know, it's so rich, actually, I think. And of course you can criticize it because it's so eccentric in a way, you know, and particularly on this grounds of the economic, you know. I think, yeah, I mean, it's sort of indisputable in some way. But still this kind of richness, you know, is really important. I mean, a figure who suffered in a critical sense, at least, not so much in Italy, but in the way his work was received outside Italy, was Carlo Scarpa, you know, who is also uneconomic, you know. It's a cultural, yes, I mean, I don't think I don't know how people like that manage to emerge, you know, and to practice in the real world, so to speak, you know. How do they do it? You know, how do they, how do they begin even, you know? And it would not be possible for someone in Italy to practice as Scarpa practiced today, I think. So again, you have this phenomenon of a time-bound, you know, the appearance of a certain body of work that has a very strong cultural power, but now you can't do that anymore. You know, I mean, it's inconceivable in a way. But that's why I think Wang Shu is interesting, very interesting from this point of view. You know, from the point of view of the resistance. Of course, you know, you could say, you know, this evocation of traditional is too contrived in a way, or too self-conscious or something. But I think it's impressive.
Can we take one last question from the audience?
Thank you very much. I had the most wonderful evening. I was a student at this school about 40 years ago, and I was absolutely enchanted that you mentioned Sert, who I think was the most extraordinary genius I ever met in my life. But what appeals to me about what's happened tonight is that I live in Shanghai. I've lived in Shanghai for 20 years, and I've really contributed, I think, to the destruction of Chinese cities to some extent as a Westerner. But I think that what I've heard tonight from everybody seems to me to offer pointers to redress what is happening in China and helping with the problems of Chinese cities, which are really to do with equity and access to good resources and space and air and water and all of those sorts of things. Really, the last thing China needs now is architecture. You know, it really doesn't need that at all. What it needs is landscape skills and people like Sert. And I think it's going to get a lot out of hearing what you've said tonight about redressing the balance, pulling things back a bit, the way that you know, you've talked about Wang Shu and people like that doing. So I think it's been absolutely wonderful for me to hear it from that practical and pragmatic point of view, that it might pull Chinese thinking or Western thinking that have wrecked Chinese cities back a little bit so that they can start to do proper things. And I think that's been fantastic. And that's the great thing that I see that Wang Shu could contribute, apart from anything else, you know. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Also thank, again, Professor Kenneth Frampton for joining us tonight. And thank everybody for staying to the very last minute with us. Thank you.